What I want to talk to you today is a sort of strange subject. I called it New Times. I called it New Times because the way in which, the mode in which we have lived all our life, I obviously much longer than you, but for a long, long time, this mode of life that we have had is gone, and it's over. And I want to try and explain a little bit about why it's over, what I mean by it being gone. But this is probably the most important thing that has happened in decades. And why it's quite curious, I think, is that no one really actually notices it much. It's out there, but actually no one talks about it. It's not seen. It's something that is not really very apparent. But the implications are huge. And they're certainly going to affect all of you very, very directly. So I wanted to try and explain what these new times are. In fact, really is probably the most significant thing that has happened not just in the last few decades, but something that has not happened now for maybe a century or so. What is it in brief? Growth is over. Economic growth is finished. Growth as we've known it over this period, growth as we've known it from the Industrial Revolution, is finished. And it's going to have huge implications as a consequence. I would like to try and explain a little bit why growth is over. But let me say, first of all, that growth being over is not something that is deliberate. This is something that has come about from concatenation of different forces that are taking place in our economy, in our societies, that are producing a period of no growth. In fact, there has not been much growth for some time now. There's not been growth since 2005, if not earlier. But with no growth, it also means the end of globalization. It's the end of the globalized world as we know it. I'm not going to suggest that this is going to happen overnight, because there are too many powerful vested interests in globalization that are going to keep propelling it along for this period. But globalization is coming to an end, and therefore a lot is going to come to an end with it. That is, all of these projects of centralization are going to come to an end. That is also the fact that many of the centrist parties, political parties that we have lived with for much of our years, are going to die if they're unable to change, and most of them will not be able to change, and we will be living in new times. And I will try and then suggest a little bit maybe what those new times will mean for you. So why is growth over? Growth is over, first of all, for various reasons that are, some of them will be more apparent, but I'll just start with one of them. The main source of growth in the last century, the main source of stimulation, was, of course, European Industrial Revolution. And that produced huge changes, and it also produced a huge dislocation in society. Huge waves of communities were uprooted, disembedded from community, from their societies, as part of the process of industrialization and economic changes that took place there. We have had something that is of a magnitude of about 80 times the Industrial Revolution that has been taking place in these recent years. But I don't think that many of us, and certainly I really haven't noticed it. The Chinese migration from the rural areas to the urban areas, to the sea coasts, from the center of China, has created new towns and new industrial centers equivalent in size to 88 times the size of London, is the size of population movements that have taken place. It dwarfs our industrial revolution. It really changes. I mean, our European industrial revolution is really quite sort of childish compared with the Chinese industrial revolution. Well, this is coming to an end. It actually is already ended. I mean, not with a bang, but the slow return now of Chinese back to the from the urban areas to the countryside is already underway. In fact, many of the Chinese are now moving and are finding and looking for work in Vietnam and other countries because wages have risen in China and employment has gone down. Why is this so important to all of you is really this, that for much of this period you've been told there's really been growth in the West, and actually, you know, when I say there's been no growth for some time, the statistics don't bear that out, so there must be something wrong here. But actually what we do see is the fact that during this period, real incomes have been stagnant or falling. Indeed, McKinsey, a very establishment organization, has said since 2005, 60 to 70% of Europeans have experienced no or a declining growth since 2005, a long period with no income growth. Why has this not been so noticed is really because at the same time, the Chinese huge increase in production, industrial production, has given us cheaper goods, cheaper products. So we felt a little bit better off, although in fact our incomes have not been rising during that period. In other words, we haven't had trickle-down economics coming and making us feel better off. We've had trickle across from China that is actually, and most of our sort of GDP increase that we think we've achieved ourselves is actually not ours, really. It's been a trickle across from China, but that's coming to an end. Then there are other reasons. Of course, many European societies, and America is getting older, the age pattern is changing, and the consumption levels of an aging population are much less. But the other most powerful element in the decline in growth, I would say, is the technology, which was at the outset job creative, growth inducing, is now turning to be the opposite. It's going to be job destructive in all respects. I'm sure most of you have seen this. Robotics, which we used to think of as being employed in the car firms, are now writing newspapers, are in all of the lawyers' firms looking through and doing the preparation of cases, because it's much quicker to have a robot go through masses of cases looking for things and than to have people doing it. But what I want to focus is on something quite different, and I have to just try and explain it. We have no growth because our system is bust and is gone and it is over. And that is our mode in which we have lived since the Second World War, which has been based on debt-driven stimulus to growth, of producing more debt and more debt and more debt in order to stimulate more growth. We have been doing that since the Second World War. Initially, there was some growth by, if you like, printing money and creating more, if you like, GDP as a consequence. But now that process has really run out. It's not producing any further growth. If you look at the ECB statistics, for each €1 of GDP growth, it now takes it to print 18.5 euros to produce that 1 degree of growth. So this is breaking down. I want to emphasize that and the policy that accompanies it of monetary policy has failed in two ways. Failing economically, as I described, it's just simply not produced the growth. What it has produced is a huge mountain of debt. If you like, in global terms, our debt is now more than 2.5 times our global output. Not much of this debt is moribund and probably is unrepayable and will never be repaid, and that's hanging over. But it is not only its economic failure, but its political failure. It is a political time bomb that is facing us at the moment, because it has been accompanied by zero interest rates. Why? After the failure of 2008, the great financial crisis that took place in 2008, there was a compact in the G7 amongst the leaders. It was agreed that they simply would go on as before, make a little change here and there, but no great changes in the banks or the financial systems at all. And they would do two things. They would pretend and they would insist on saying that all this debt is repayable and will be repaid, even this huge amount of debt that may not be effective, and that then they would strengthen the bank's balance sheets and subsidize the banks sufficiently that all this debt could be turned over at zero cost, so that it could be continued. This was known as the pretend and extend policy. That was the compact. And the only basis in which it was believed that this would ever work was because everyone hoped there would be inflation that would wash away the debt, or there'd be growth, and whoosh, we'd be back. But there's been no growth. There's been no growth. And then since 2008, the debt gets bigger and bigger. But the political aspect of this, the thing that will affect all of you, me no so much, I'm already past pension age, but you're not, is zero interest rates, which now cannot be increased. We have a size of debt now that the people in the Wall Street calculate that the bond debt and the bond bull market that has existed for the last 3 decades is now so used to 1% or zero interest rates at that time, that if the Federal Reserve was to increase the rate by 100 basis points, i.e. 1%, there would be trillions of losses across the system. Trillions. This is the biggest hedge fund manager who's just repeated this to the Federal Reserve last week. He said, if you raise interest rates 1%, you'll bring down the system and you'll bring down the European banks. So we can't actually get out of it in that way. We can't actually get back to normal interest rates. So we're stuck at 1% or 0%. And that means most of you won't have pensions when you retire, if it continues like this. If you're somewhere around 40, I know you're not, but if you're around about 40 and you're in one of the main European countries, you will be getting letters from your pension provider that are saying, look, I'm terribly sorry, you may have thought you were going to get 50,000 euros at the end of your 30 years service with us, but now you're going to be lucky to get 17 or 18. Because how much do you have to save in capital at 1% interest that is going to earn you a living pension at a later date? It's just not possible out of the incomes that are going to do. So this is going to destroy a generation if it continues. This is a political bombshell. It's a political bombshell, not just an economic one. Because it separates my generation from your generation. The debt, and then of course there is the debt that, as I say, if the interest rates rise, it becomes unrepayable. How do we get out of the debt problem? There's only really one way of doing that. Either you have to let much of this debt is bad loans that are never going to be repaid. This is the problem in Italy. We have our banks with billions of debt, and all of it is in non-performing loans. It's fine now because we have the 2008 sort of agreement. It just gets turned over and over and over by the banks at 0% interest, and it goes on. But at some point, someone will either have to say, we're going to have to cut the debt, and the debt will not be repaid, or else we will have it explode somewhere or other in Deutsche Bank or in Monte Paschi di Siena, and we will find that we have a major destruction of wealth taking place in our societies. So this is what you face. But I want to go one further and say why it's even worse for you. And that is because of quantitative easing, printing of money. And I mentioned that the ECB has been printing trillions of money, along with the Federal Reserve. At the moment, we print between the various central banks something of the order of $200 billion per month. 200 billion a month is created. Most of us don't notice it. I mean, we assume, we're told in the press and the perpetually optimistic politicians and others that say, oh, everything's awesome, it's fine, and this is designed to sort of re-stimulate the economy and to help you along. But actually, when a central bank prints money, it doesn't create wealth. What it does is it creates, if you like, purchasing power. When that euro comes off the electronic, and if you like, comes the electronic digit, it is purchasing power. It has zero in it. It's not reflecting of labor, it's not reflecting of services provided, it's just printed. And it's purchasing power. Then that purchasing power is channeled through the intermediary of the financial banks and the financial system. And then that system directs the purchasing power in terms of credit to others. But of course, the entity that gets the newly minted purchasing power has to get it from somewhere. So it's effectively taken from other entities. There's no growth. So the purchasing power has had to come from somewhere, and it's come from your pockets, my pockets. It's the devaluation of our currencies. Why don't we notice it? Why is all of this obscure? Why can't we see this? Because there's a trick that has been done to make this less clear. Normally, when you print money in vast quantities, as I think all of you know, you have inflation, and prices go up. Why don't you see inflation? Simply because if the central banks operate together, as they do, what they've been doing is devaluing in tandem. So all of them devalue together. All the trading partners of the dollar have been devaluing during this period since 2009 by about 14%. They just devalue and devalue. And to make sure you don't notice how much you're devalued, every so often the central banks take a steam hammer to the price of gold and hammer that down so that you don't have any sort of objective metric by which you can see that actually your purchasing power has gone. What is the implications of that? Well, they're very profound, because actually what we are facing in Europe, and which is going to be so difficult to deal with, is that whereas you, if I'm not talking about you here, but Europeans as a whole, have had no income. We're talking, when we say 60 to 70%, let me remind you of 500 to 600 million Europeans have had no increase in real terms. This is McKinsey, establishment firm, saying this, not some bizarre organization, have had no increase in income from 2009. But actually, of course, our costs have all gone up during this period. And so all of the things that you can't avoid, the rental has gone up, the food costs have gone up, energy has gone up, transport has gone up, and the amount of income that everyone has that is left over in order to buy consumer goods has been shrinking. This is known as debt deflation, because actually you're paying much more in terms of economic rent to the banks, you're paying mortgages or you're paying rent. And as asset prices go up, of course, the owners of asset prices want more income to reflect the increasing asset prices. So the house prices go up, and therefore the rental goes up, and it goes up. But median incomes have stayed smaller and smaller. And so we have now 70% of the population are really at the edge. I mean, are poor in the sense, very, very, not knowing from one month to another if they can survive. 63% of Americans, because it's the same thing in America, 63% of Americans cannot afford $500 or $1,000 in the case of a medical emergency or the breakdown of their car. The total savings, the average savings for American families for retirement, 70% of Americans, 72% of Americans do not have more than $5,000 in their retirement savings account. This is what if you don't believe me, this is actually what Trump and what Brexit were about as much as anything else. It is the fact that in Europe there is huge areas of economic life that have become moribund and impoverished. And now they are saying to their political leaders, and they're saying this quite clearly, I want you to listen to me and to understand my problem and what I am doing. They say that because they see, you take a small town in Europe, let's call it anything, you take this town, it has tens of thousands of migrants, refugees in it. Well, the authorities have to house them. So the rents are going up because of the housing necessities of the migrants. And then people are worried, well, what about my grandmother? She is in a rented accommodation, and when the rent goes up, what happens to her next? They look at their children at school, and they see that most of the children at school are in classes now, no longer of 25, but 45. They can't get to the doctors. But the critical thing is that they know that if they lose their job, it'll probably be someone from Eastern Europe who will come in and who is better skilled, to be frank, than they are, and will take the job for less money. People are nervous and frightened. And so this is one of the things that I think, what are new times likely to mean? I think the new times are as I likely to mean, also that people are going to change their relation. The new times is going to be a reversion to looking at the state. Looking at the state and expecting the state, first of all, to protect them from the effects of globalization, from the effects of migration. Not because these people are racists or bigots, but because they're living at the edge. And they don't have, they're not part of the wealthy 1% that you'll see moving around in London. London's doing very nicely. Go outside of London and you'll see something different. Actually, the percentages I gave you give a wrong figure. I live in Italy. The figure McKinsey gave for people who've had no increase in income or a decrease since 2005, in Italy they gave the figure as 97%. I mean, you have to think what that means politically about the future. So I think one of the things that we will see is a reversion back to the sense of the state. I think that it is normal, and you would expect people at times of feeling vulnerable and feeling threatened will want the state to protect them. And one of the problems we've had is they don't feel the state has listened to them or takes the slightest interest in their problems. Actually, their only remedy for the 60 to 70% who are in the state is to police them rather than to listen to them. So I think that we have a sense of a moving back to the state, but also what we have appearing in this as a consequence of this is the idea of the state must be the ultimate guarantor of community. So what I'm talking about is a sense of de-globalisation, decentralisation. People want, it's going to be more introverted, and I think they will, if you like, expect and look to the state to do things, more things, to take responsibility for community. So it is against, if you like, the neoliberal idea of individualism and private enterprise that is not regulated or very little regulated by the state, and we are going to see a move towards the rebirth of the idea of the state again. Of course, this has huge consequences. I mean, the consequences, as I described, is neoliberal globalization is over. It's, even the Financial Times agrees that it's in retreat and gone. It's over, and it will, of course, mean that centralization is over. And I think one of the things that will be very clear from what I've probably said, and all of you who have picked it up, is, of course, one of the biggest, if you like, globalization project is the European Union. So what we are looking at is, if you like, that the currents of the new times are actually the reverse of the currents of the European Union, which is, and still is, and they would like to reinforce towards more centralization. One of the aspects, of course, in this too, is that as people start to look at how to protect themselves and how to think again of the state in a different way, comes the more apparent, the contradiction between, if you like, the financialized, if you like, globalization in which we live, the contrast between that, the tension between that and democracy. They don't work together. I mean, that was perfectly obvious when Mrs. Thatcher came into it. The financialized globalization is a project of Wall Street in the City of London, and is controlled out of the European Union by the Troika and the Eurozone group. The Eurozone group is the group which does not exist in any legal form in the European Union, but makes all the decisions about Europe. So we have a sharp, if you like, clash about the role of the state, about the need to recoup sovereignty, and also the question of the tension that has existed between, and has perhaps become more clarified. What I think has happened with the situation we're in is that suddenly it becomes clear to people that there isn't democracy, if you like, in the neoliberal globalized project at all, that actually it's at odds with the collective needs of a community. That is, these are very different things. So what is this going to mean politically? I'm quite conscious that there's been a conference going on. I've been part of it in here in the city, looking at what European Union needs to do and how it should cope with this. One of the themes that comes quite clearly out of this, I heard the Prime Minister of Albania saying this, and I've heard others saying that, and they said, well, you know, what we have to do, and I think also your Prime Minister saying, well, you know, we have to anchor Serbia and we have to anchor our states. You know, we can't anchor them in the old anchorages of the past. We have to anchor them in the new projects. The obvious implication he was talking about was anchoring it in a sense, in the European Union, and saying that this may be the right anchorage for the future. And the tensions were displayed. But what, therefore, where are new times and what is the thinking of New Times? Because the other theme that came up was, of course, what everyone knows here by the acronym TINA. There is no alternative. Globalization is the only game in town. I mean, you say this and you make these criticisms that there's no growth, but what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting to them that actually, it's absolutely untrue that there is no alternative. There is no alternative to what I've described very carefully as neoliberalized globalism. Financialized, neoliberalized globalism, which is what we have at the moment. There is, and there are people that are thinking about it. If you go to Russia, you will find there is a very active group of economists that are formed under the heading of the Stolypin Club. People like Sergei Glaziev and others that are precisely looking at what would be a future economic structure in the circumstances that we face. And many of them are going back to the ideas of the economist Friedrich List, who was the great antagonist of Adam Smith, but who believed in what he called the national economy, political economics. He looked at the question of, he believed that individual states had to have arrangements to meet their individual cultures and their individual needs, that they weren't all homogeneous and could be sort of lumped together, and that might mean that they would need to take special measures to look at protecting their economy for a period, directing that there was a big difference between the individual and the state's responsibility for the collective welfare of the people. And that the important thing was the collective welfare, and the state had to take a view on this. He was also very much critical of free trade. And he said, of course, free trade, but he was celebrated for being very critical of Britain's advocacy of free trade. A theme, by the way, I heard at great length last night how wonderful it was, because he was very dubious about who benefits from this free trade. So there is certainly a form of economic thinking taking place. Then what about, well, what is this New Times and where is it going? Something very significant took place in this last month with the Chinese premier visit. First of all, his speech on the anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, and then at the G20 meeting which China hosted. I don't suppose many of you have seen it much in the Western press or the press here, but Xi said some very important things in one of those sections. First of all, he said, the Western economy, the financial world is about to implode and we will face a crisis. He said, secondly, that this crisis is going to bring about a new global order, and it will come in the next years. And he said that this new global order will be led by China and Russia. I just want to emphasize what he was not suggesting, because I might give that impression if I leave it there. He was not suggesting that to swap one hegemony for another hegemony. He was very clear that it had to be a much more multilateral global order that took place. But then, much more reported in the Russian press than in any other, perhaps because he spoke more to the Russian journalists, Xi said something else. He said to Russia, he invited Russia to be a co-partner in a military alliance. He said, we need a military alliance that can stop the aggressions of NATO. And if we work together, Russia and China can render NATO impotent. What he was implying, in a sense, is a new global order is being made and is underway, but we cannot do this because NATO occupies all the space. It's pushing against Russia, pushing against China. And for a new global order to come into being, there has to be some more space. We have to make, if you like, physical space, but space to give it room to grow up, to be threatened all the time and pushed and under pressure. So Russia should work closely with China to bring about a new military alliance. And China then suggested, repeated the importance in its view of OBOR, the One Belt, One Road project, the massive New Silk Road communications. People are quite skeptical about that, and I think we should all understand China has, of course, huge economic problems itself because it's precisely followed a neoliberal economic policy for a number of years, one which Xi is now recognized as unsustainable, and an economic policy, a monetary policy that is similar. And what he is trying to suggest is that instead of, if you like, financialized expansion, attempts at growth, that what you have to try and do is actually a physical underpinning of growth by connectivities, by railways, pipelines, movements through the sea, create, if you like, the physical connectivity that will both provide work and provide a real stimulus for activity, not just asset value increase. I'm not sure it'll work, but I'm just giving you these. I'm not sure either if Friedrich List will become, if you like, although it's taken up quite widely in China and thought about a lot in Russia, whether this will become, if you like, the new orthodoxy, I can't say. But I just wanted to mention what's happening in Russia and China and other countries, because it's not the case that there is no alternative, that it is only, there is only this financialized, globalized system is the only way ahead. And I want to finish on then a prediction. What is going to happen? I think, first of all, I would say two things about politicals. All of the leftist, social left parties, most typically people like Blairites, Clintons and others, totally were invested in the Wall Street paradigm, the Wall Street financialized system. They made that decision, they are completely invested in that, and they are discredited by that because they will not be able to provide the answers to the lack of growth from that. And I think those parties will largely lose at the elections. I think also that we will see that there will be a strong reaction from those parties. You can already hear the narrative being set very clearly. What are we going to do with this rightist, if you like, polarization of the politics? We have it on the left and we have on the right these right wings, and these are a threat. Well, firstly, I think that these new ideas are not confined to Russia and China. They are also being mentioned, of course, by Mr. Trump in his criticisms of the big, fat, ugly bubbles that the Federal Reserve has created. Asset prices, bond prices at these unsustainable levels, and which will crash sooner or later. But also you have, again, I think from an unlikely source, Mrs. May saying, well, maybe the Bank of England needs to stop quantitative easing, monetary accommodation, because actually it's done more damage to a certain section. She said this at the Conservative Party conference. So actually the sort of alternatives are coming not from, I don't think the right is the right term here, because it's not from an intellectual rightist position that's coming. It actually, if it comes from anywhere, it comes from people like Pat Buchanan, who was a presidential candidate some long time ago, but who was very much immersed in the Catholic tradition. And the Catholic tradition was one of rejecting, if you like, a purely monetarist view of life, and also believed in the community, the importance of family as the structure on which institutions were based, and on the idea, the Catholic idea of the people as a whole, and that the welfare of the people meant the welfare of an aggregate of people, not just a few of the people. So there are roots to this. I think it's quite difficult for the left at the moment to provide an answer to this problem because of their roots in internationalism. Because they're internationalists and always have been internationalists, it's quite hard for them to argue against globalization. Even though internationalism and what I call neoliberal globalization are really quite different. I think there will be a strong defense put up by, if you like, the liberal elites who are all gathered here, who have, if you like, a real fear now that they can feel that their own position is becoming quite vulnerable. Because all of their narrative has been, well, you know, our liberal economic policies, our neoliberal policies, I mean, they've raised up people's welfare. I mean, free trade has helped, you know, poor people in India and brown people everywhere to get a little bit better off in usual sort of colonial language. In fact, of course, it's been pointed out for a long time by people like Joseph Stiglitz, who won a Nobel Prize for economics, and he said 15 years ago in a book, he said, you know, what's going on here? I mean, you know, all the West says, oh, how wonderful free trade and development has been for all of these countries. Well, why is it so disliked by those countries? And he says, you know, it's a real problem. How do we understand it? They all say, oh, but they're all much better off. Haven't we raised the Chinese out of poverty, etc.? And he says, well, you know, the answer is that they come up and say, well, of course we've raised it out of it. And if those people think that they are not better off, then it's a problem for their psychiatrist, not for us economists to deal with. But the reality is many of those countries have suffered huge elements of poverty, and that now that crisis, if you like, of the bisection between a well-off minority, 1%, and then a huge wodge of moribund people living moribund lives without employment and poverty, has now come and has sit itself down in the middle of the European Union. This is the problem we have, and this is why the crisis is such a severe crisis. So I'll conclude with saying, this is what you're going to hear next from these people, I predict. And they will say, oh, look, you know, the problem wasn't with liberalization, with globalization, or neoliberalism. All of that was fine. It did wonderful things in India and China and brought all the wealth up. It was just, maybe there's a problem of inequalities of wealth. And look what it's given rise to. It's given rise to all of these unsavory parties on the extreme right and the extreme left. So we'll demonize those, and we'll say, actually what we need is more globalization. But we'll tidy it up and make it a little bit more equitable for everyone. And the 1% should be able to sort of keep going at the top level. So I'll stop there and say that that's my prediction from the narrative that you will hear in the face of what I've just outlined to you. But really, this is, you have to think just how serious this is, that if globalization is over, if growth is gone for the foreseeable future, for your lifetimes, what is going to be the implication politically? How do you manage it? How are you going to manage this economically and think of the state? Also, it has important implications as I described. Where is the new anchor, if you like, for politics for the coming time? Is it on the Atlantic in America? Is it in Brussels? Or is it going to be in Central Asia, Eurasia, with the China-Russia project? What about all these so-called damaging little parties on the right and left that are so unnerving, if you like, the center of politics? Do they have something to say? Well, they certainly are reflecting. I mean, they are, as I said, this is the people who've been speaking for Brexit, for Trump, and they've been saying that they're hurt, and they're in pain, and they want someone to listen. And people haven't been listening, but have been arguing for better policing. I think all of that's over. It's going to be a difficult transition, but you are going to be in the middle of this transition, and you will have, it will be much harder, and there will be much fewer jobs around. And I worry for my children as much as I worry for others. I'm sorry to sound pessimistic, but I just want you to say that when you come to these great inflection points in history, almost certainly you never see the grassroots, the green shoots that are already growing until you're past, if you like, that inflection point. Then you look back and you say, well, wasn't it obvious? You know, this is the new ideas and the new thinking that is coming up. This is how civilization moves on, changes from one state to another. We're going through those states. They're not always comfortable. They involve quite a lot of turmoil. But of course the outcome is good. Of course it will be. And it's always good when something old and rotten decays and passes out. And long live whatever is born in its place. Thank you.